I've learned something over a very long life. The most dangerous shifts never announce themselves loudly. They don't arrive with alarms or dramatic headlines. They arrive quietly, through a memo, a directive, a single signature at the bottom of a page. And by the time the consequences become visible, most people are shocked, even though the warning signs were there all along. That's exactly what we're witnessing right now. What's unfolding between the United States and Canada is not a temporary dispute. It's not a hard negotiation tactic, and it's certainly not business as usual. It's a structural break, the kind that takes decades to build and only moments to damage. And once it begins, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult. This isn't about political loyalty. It's not about who you support or oppose. It's about economic architecture. The systems that quietly support prosperity, stability, and trust. Systems that once weakened don't simply snap back into place. Canada isn't just another trading partner. It's the United States' largest. It's a country bound by geography, history, and one of the deepest economic integrations ever constructed between two sovereign nations. A shared border without fortification, shared supply chains, shared industries, shared security assumptions. That kind of relationship isn't accidental. It's built slowly, deliberately, and with mutual confidence, and confidence is now cracking. The turning point came not with a negotiation but with a unilateral decision, a sweeping policy move that treated a deeply integrated partner as if it were an external rival. Across-the-board trade penalties imposed without distinction, without precision, and without regard for how intertwined the two economies truly are. This wasn't a scalpel, it was a hammer. When policies of that scale are introduced, the damage doesn't remain contained. It spreads through construction costs, manufacturing margins, energy prices, and ultimately household budgets. It shows up in boardrooms first, then payroll decisions, then consumer prices. And it doesn't stop at economics, because trade isn't just about goods crossing borders, it's about expectations. It's about whether businesses believe the rules will still apply tomorrow, whether investments made today will still make sense next year, whether partnerships formed over decades are still worth defending. Once that confidence is lost, behavior changes immediately. Companies delay hiring. Investments are frozen, supply chains are redesigned, not for efficiency but for survival. That's already happening. Construction firms are recalculating costs as key materials face sudden price shocks. Manufacturers are reassessing production strategies built on cross-border integration. Energy markets are adjusting risk premiums, anticipating disruptions that didn't exist weeks earlier. None of this is theoretical. These are rational responses to instability. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that it targets a relationship that was working. This wasn't a broken system in need of repair. It was one of the most successful economic partnerships in modern history, one that supported millions of jobs, stabilized prices, and strengthened both countries simultaneously. Breaking something functional doesn't create leverage. It creates fallout. And the fallout doesn't stay local. Every country watching this is paying attention. If a nation can treat its closest partner as expendable, then no agreement feels permanent, no alliance feels secure, and no investment feels fully protected. That realization pushes nations to adapt, quietly, strategically, and often permanently. What we're seeing now is not outrage or retaliation for its own sake. It's recalculation. A slow, methodical reassessment of dependence, exposure, and long-term risk. And once that process starts, it rarely stops on its own. This is how economic fractures begin, not with collapse, but with confidence quietly slipping away. When a system as deeply integrated as the North American economy is disrupted, there's a common misunderstanding about what comes next. Many assume the response is optional, that the other side can simply absorb the shock, stay calm, and wait it out. That assumption is wrong. Once broad trade penalties are imposed, especially without prior coordination, the affected country no longer has the luxury of patience. The response stops being economic and becomes structural and political. Canada's reaction was not emotional, it was unavoidable. Within days, countermeasures were announced. Not indiscriminately, not chaotically, but with precision. The targets were chosen carefully: sectors with political visibility, regions with electoral importance, industries that could not ignore the pressure. That wasn't escalation for the sake of conflict, it was deterrence. Because in trade conflicts, silence is interpreted as weakness. Any government that fails to respond decisively risks losing domestic credibility, not just with voters, but with businesses, labor groups, and institutional investors who depend on predictability. Once retaliation begins, the dynamic changes completely. At that point, neither side is negotiating from a position of calm advantage. Both are defending face, stability, and political legitimacy. Backing down becomes costly, compromise becomes difficult, and what began as a policy decision hardens into a cycle. This is where trade conflicts stop being about trade. They become feedback loops. The economic consequences started surfacing almost immediately. Price expectations adjusted first, not because goods vanished overnight, but because markets price future disruption faster than physical shortages appear. Construction inputs reacted, manufacturing margins tightened, energy contracts recalculated risk. These shifts don't show up instantly on store shelves, but they move quickly through balance sheets. Businesses don't wait for losses to materialize, they anticipate them, and anticipation changes behavior. Hiring plans are paused, capital expenditures are delayed, expansion projects are shelved. From the outside, it looks like caution. From the inside, it's defensive positioning. This is the hidden cost of policy volatility. It doesn't require a recession to inflict damage. It simply needs uncertainty to persist long enough for rational actors to protect themselves. And protection at scale looks like slowdown. What's especially damaging in this case is that the penalties don't fall where they're intended. Broad trade barriers don't neatly punish foreign producers. They flow through integrated systems and settle where resistance is weakest. That usually means workers, manufacturing jobs tied to cross-border supply chains, logistics roles dependent on consistent volume, energy-intensive industries operating on thin margins. These roles don't disappear in a single announcement. They erode quietly through reduced shifts, delayed contracts, and gradual downsizing. By the time the impact is visible in employment data, the decisions have already been made. This is why the idea that it will all be sorted out later is dangerously misleading. Economic systems remember instability. Once firms begin redesigning supply chains to reduce exposure, those decisions tend to be permanent. Once alternative partners are identified, relationships deepen. Once investments are redirected, they don't easily return. Every day of uncertainty pushes the system further away from its original equilibrium. And that's the deeper issue here. This isn't just about tariffs, it's about whether the underlying assumptions of cooperation still hold. If businesses believe agreements can be altered overnight, they stop treating them as foundations. They treat them as temporary conveniences, useful only until something safer emerges. That mindset is already taking hold, and once it spreads, the damage compounds. There's a critical mistake policymakers make when dealing with deeply integrated economies. They assume integration is flexible, that it can be tightened or loosened at will, like a valve. It can't. Integration isn't a switch, it's a structure. Over decades, businesses, workers, infrastructure, and capital align around a shared assumption: continuity. Factories are built where logistics make sense. Skills develop around stable supply chains. Investment flows follow predictable rules. None of that is accidental, and none of it is resilient to sudden shocks. When broad trade barriers are introduced, the system doesn't adapt smoothly. It fractures along stress lines that were invisible during stability. What used to function as one continuous process splits into multiple disconnected decisions, each driven by risk avoidance. That's when inefficiency replaces optimization. Consider manufacturing. A modern production line doesn't source parts from one place. Components cross borders multiple times before final assembly. This isn't wasteful, it's efficient. Each stage occurs where it's cheapest, fastest, or most specialized. Add blanket tariffs to that system and costs don't rise linearly, they compound. Each border crossing becomes a penalty. Each delay multiplies downstream disruption. Each uncertainty forces contingency planning that adds overhead without adding value. The immediate response isn't relocation, it's hesitation. Executives don't move factories overnight. They stop committing capital, they extend depreciation schedules, they freeze hiring, they preserve cash. From the outside, this looks like prudence. From the macro level, it looks like stagnation. And stagnation doesn't announce itself with headlines. It creeps. Projects that would have existed simply don't. Jobs that would have been created never appear. Growth that was expected quietly vanishes. That loss is invisible, but permanent. Now look at energy. Energy markets are built on long-term assumptions. Refineries are engineered for specific inputs. Infrastructure is financed on predictable flows. Contracts span years, not months. When policy uncertainty enters that environment, pricing reacts instantly, not because supply has disappeared, but because risk has increased. Risk gets priced. That pricing flows outward. Higher transportation costs, higher production costs, higher consumer prices, not because anyone wants them higher, but because uncertainty demands compensation. And here's the part that rarely gets discussed. Once alternative routes and partners become economically viable, they stop being alternatives. They become defaults. If exporters invest in new infrastructure to reach different markets, they won't abandon those routes simply because the original partner stabilizes. The whole point of diversification is to reduce dependence, which means the original relationship never fully recovers. This is what economists mean by path dependence. Decisions made under pressure create trajectories that outlast the pressure itself. That's why these moments matter so much. Short-term disruption becomes long-term realignment, and the longer uncertainty persists, the deeper that realignment goes. This isn't theoretical. We've seen it before. Industries don't collapse when trade friction appears. They adapt away, gradually, quietly, rationally. By the time political leaders realize what's been lost, the system has already moved on. That's the danger of blunt force economic policy applied to complex systems. It doesn't break loudly, it unravels silently, and once unraveling begins, restoring the original structure requires more than removing the initial cause. It requires rebuilding trust, predictability, and confidence, things that take far longer to restore than they do to destroy. There's a reason capital always moves ahead of public opinion. Capital doesn't wait for certainty. It reacts to probability. Investors, institutions, pension funds, insurers, they don't ask what will happen. They ask what could happen, and how exposed are we if it does. And when policy introduces unpredictability, capital doesn't argue. It reallocates. This is where the real damage begins. Quietly, invisibly, and long before headlines catch up. When trade relationships destabilize, companies face a simple but uncomfortable question. Can we still rely on this market 5 years from now? If the answer isn't a confident yes, capital adjusts accordingly. That adjustment doesn't look dramatic at first. It looks like a delayed factory expansion, a canceled logistics upgrade, a research center built somewhere else, a supply contract written with an alternative partner. None of these make the news, but together they reshape economies. Here's what most people miss. Capital hates reversibility. If a decision can be undone cheaply, it's tolerable. If it can't, capital demands safety. Once investors commit billions to new infrastructure, new routes, new markets, those commitments lock in behavior for decades. No one willingly returns to dependence after paying to escape it. This is why uncertainty is more damaging than bad policy. Bad policy can be priced. Uncertainty cannot. And when uncertainty can't be priced, capital leaves. Not out of anger, not out of ideology, out of discipline. Now let's talk about institutional money, because this is where the shift becomes structural. Large investors don't chase headlines, they manage exposure. If a country begins to signal that trade rules may change suddenly, that alliances are conditional, that agreements depend on political cycles rather than frameworks, that countries' risk premium rises. Higher risk premium means higher borrowing costs, lower valuations, reduced foreign investment, not because fundamentals collapsed, but because confidence did, and confidence is everything. Once lost, it doesn't return quickly. That's why capital flight doesn't reverse when policy stabilizes. It reverses only when trust is rebuilt, and trust is slow. Meanwhile, people feel the consequences later. Workers notice when hiring slows. Consumers notice when prices creep up. Communities notice when investment never arrives. But by then, the decision has already been made. Capital has already chosen a different future. And here's the most dangerous part of all this. Political systems operate on election cycles. Economic systems operate on investment cycles. Those cycles are not aligned. A policy choice made for short-term political advantage can lock in long-term economic consequences that outlive the policymakers who made it. By the time leadership changes, the capital has moved, the infrastructure is built elsewhere, and the leverage is gone. This is how nations lose influence without losing power overnight, not through collapse, but through erosion, step by step, decision by decision, quietly. And when people finally ask, "How did we end up here?" the answer is almost always the same: because we underestimated how quickly confidence can disappear and how slowly it returns. There's a moment in every broken system when repair stops being a question of will and becomes a question of cost. That moment rarely looks dramatic. No announcements, no deadlines, no official acknowledgement. It arrives quietly, when reversing course becomes more expensive than continuing forward. This is the point most people misunderstand. They assume that once policy changes, relationships reset, that once tariffs are lifted, trust reappears, that once rhetoric softens, capital returns. That's not how systems work. By the time leadership considers reversal, the incentives have already shifted. New contracts have been signed, new routes have been financed, new dependencies have replaced old ones. The original system doesn't snap back, it gets bypassed. And here's the critical reality: diversification is sticky. Once companies invest to reduce dependence, they don't reconcentrate risk just because the pressure eases. The entire point of diversification is to never be vulnerable again, which means even if the initial trigger disappears, the behavior remains. That's why temporary measures are the most dangerous kind. They justify permanent responses. Now zoom out for a moment. What's actually being tested here isn't a trade policy, it's a principle. The principle that agreements matter, that partnerships are stable, that rules aren't rewritten midstream. When that principle weakens, every relationship recalibrates, not emotionally, structurally. This is how influence erodes, not because others become stronger, but because they stop depending on you. Dependence is leverage. Reliability creates dependence. Unpredictability destroys it. Once that leverage is gone, no amount of power restores it quickly. This is why mature economies behave cautiously, why they negotiate precisely, why they avoid blunt force tools unless absolutely necessary, because they understand something simple but brutal. You can intimidate markets for a moment. You cannot command trust. Trust must be earned continuously, and once broken, it returns slowly, partially, and never unconditionally. What we're witnessing now isn't collapse, it's repositioning. It's partners quietly asking, what does our future look like if this instability continues? What systems protect us from sudden shifts? Where should we commit capital so it's insulated from political swings? Those questions reshape the world more than speeches ever will. And here's the uncomfortable truth: by the time average citizens feel the full effects, higher prices, fewer opportunities, slower growth, the decisions that cause them are already irreversible. Not because anyone wanted harm, but because systems respond to incentives, not intentions. This is why warnings matter before consequences become visible. Not to assign blame, not to score points, but to recognize patterns while change is still possible. Because once the architecture of cooperation is replaced by the architecture of caution, rebuilding isn't a policy decision. It's a generational project. And history is very clear on this. Nations don't decline when they lose power. They decline when they lose trust, and don't realize it until alternatives no longer need them.